Good evening, everyone. This is the big picture session on geopolitics. We talked in the morning about the entire global order is in the process of very dramatic changes caused in some respects by the US that is reshaping its outlook, an aggressive China, a belligerent Russia involved in a debilitating Ukraine war, a volatile Middle East, and of course, the other two Asian giants, Japan and India, and what we need to do. And we have an eminent panel here to discuss this. And from on my left, as Abbas already introduced them, Admiral Arun Prakash, former Chief of Naval Staff, Mr. Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, and Mr. Vijay Chauthaiwale, in charge, Department of Foreign Affairs, BJP. Each bring their own expertise on this. Vijay is, of course, Mr. Modi's big outreach. He's the one who coined Howdy Modi and the entire diaspora that's there. Former Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal, an expert on key assignments in Moscow and other places that's there, and been at the heart of all the issues that we are now facing in Ukraine and can give us a perspective. And of course, Admiral Arun Prakash, given the fact that maritime security has become a key factor, and he had headed the Indian Navy with great distinction. Admiral Arun Prakash, may I request you to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll take it. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Admiral Prakash a very warm round of applause.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the last session of what's obviously been a very long but fruitful day for you. You explored various aspects of Indo-Japanese partnership, starting with energy, automobiles, infrastructure, finance, and so on. I think it's only appropriate that in this last session, we speak about geopolitics and security, because without security, you can't have any of the former. This session is titled the Indo-Pacific Great Game. So what is this great game about? Now, this name was given to a set of political and diplomatic confrontations that occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries between the Tsarist Russia and the British Empire. On one hand, Russia was advancing southwards, looking for warm water ports of the Arabian Sea. At the same time, the British were worried about the impact it would have on their empire. So this resulted in a strategic rivalry and conflict of interest which spanned from Persia, Afghanistan, Tibet to Central Asia. And this came to be known as the Great Game. The original Great Game finished in 1907 with a concord between Russia and Britain. But this phrase is thrown up frequently whenever one sees a clash of great powers anywhere in the world. The latest round of the Great Game is seen as having been triggered by the economic and military rise of China and its display of hegemonic ambition in the Indo-Pacific. While US and China are the leading contenders in the emerging balance of power, the vital interests of many other players, including India, Japan, Australia, and others, are also deeply involved. China's acquisition of economic heft and coercive power has led to a naked display of expansionism, manifest in many ways. China has staked untenable territorial claims in the East China Sea on Senkaku Islands and in the South China Sea via its 9-dash line. And of course, we've seen their belligerence across the Taiwan Strait, and we've experienced it on our own northern borders very recently. Now, fearing economic penalties, states are often too intimidated to respond to China's misdemeanors. And this paralysis, unfortunately, could undermine the existing liberal order. China's grand strategy, ladies and gentlemen, borrows in equal measures from the thoughts of geographer Halford Mackinder and the maritime strategist Admiral Mahan. And with these two thinkers in mind, they've created a trans-Eurasian grid of railways, pipelines, and fiber optic cables which link China with Europe. Having thus replaced Russia, which Mackinder termed as the heartland, China has taken another step towards attaining world hegemony. The geopolitical objective underpinning China's great game that seeks economic, political, and military dominance right across the Indo-Pacific is embodied in the Belt and Road Initiative, which you've all heard of. and of course its seaward component, which is the Maritime Silk Road. Concomitant with the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is China's creation of a powerful PLA Navy, which is not just to secure its maritime flank, but as per Admiral Mahan's prescription, to guard its sea lanes and to protect its merchant fleet and project force overseas. Consequently, in pursuance of these objectives, China's grand strategy is underpinned by a huge build-up of maritime power, and their maritime power consists of a merchant fleet, a fishing fleet, a coast guard, and a huge shipbuilding industry. All of these are amongst the biggest in the world. So when the US State Department acknowledges that the Indo-Pacific is the single most consequential region for America's future, and the Department of Defense renames the Pacific Command as the Indo-Pacific Command, we know where the great game is going to be played. Coming to the quadrilateral dialogue, which originated from the 2004 tsunami, where officials from 4 countries got together to form a core group. This is the origin of the Quad. Now, Quad had gone into a bit of hibernation till it was revived in 2006 by the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Speaking to the Indian Parliament thereafter, he had evoked a vision of the confluence of the 2 seas coming into being, and went on to highlight the importance of the Quad as an arc of democracy stretching from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. So what was started by Shinzo Abe and Manmohan Singh has been carried forward by Prime Ministers Modi and Kishida. Beijing's negative approach, negative reaction to the Quad, and their questioning of each member about its motives was a reflection of the significance of the Quad, because Beijing has always perceived it as a threat. Although assurances were given to Beijing that the Quad was neither an alliance nor an attempt at containment nor ganging up on China, all this failed to mollify them. But the fear of incurring China's displeasure has unfortunately compelled Quad members to remain circumspect about criticizing or taking a firm stand on China's aggressive conduct. Against this backdrop, the 4th Quad meeting, which took place in Tokyo quite recently in May this year, sent out a strong signal that the grouping was no longer a work in progress and was on its way to becoming a tangible entity. There were also clear signs that it is in the process of shedding its ambivalence towards Beijing. While reiterating support for earlier initiatives that sought cooperation in fields like vaccines, infrastructure, supply chains, and emerging technologies, this summit unveiled what could be the Quad's most significant program so far, and one which actually has security connotations, which was so far missing. This is designated the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, IPMDA, and the stated aim of this is to help countries track widespread illegal fishing and other illicit activities. But actually speaking, an elaborate system such as this will prove immensely useful in maintaining maritime surveillance and tracking platforms, including warships, submarines, and other vessels of interest right across the Indo-Pacific. Another proposal mooted separately by the US in Tokyo was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. This is obviously an attempt to counter China's BRI, and 14 countries, including all 4 Quad countries, have committed more than $500 billion to infrastructure plans, etc. Now, as we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the establishment of India-Japan diplomatic relations, we need to reflect seriously on the role that India and Japan, two of Asia's key democracies, can play security in the emerging Indo-Pacific great game. But before that, let me cast a quick glance at the past. For many Indians, the rise of the East dates back to 1905, when a Japanese fleet decimated much of Imperial Russia's navy at the famous Battle of Tsushima Strait. Europe's defeat at the hands of an Asian power, which was inconceivable till then, galvanized nationalistic fervor all over the Eastern world, especially in India. Indians of my generation also recall with considerable emotion 3 historical landmarks in Indo-Japanese relations. One, Japanese support to the Indian National Army, which fought alongside the alongside the Japanese 15th Army during the Burma campaign. Two, Justice Radha Binod Pal's vociferous dissent in the International Military Tribunal of 1946. This defiant gesture by Justice Pal is cherished both by Indians and the Japanese. And lastly, India's refusal to attend the 1951 San Francisco Peace Conference and the signing of a separate Indo-Japanese peace treaty according honor and equality to Japan in 1952. Both of these were significant diplomatic gestures. But keeping sentiment apart, partnerships in international relations are meaningful only if they pass the realpolitik test of serving the vital interests of both. Japan and India have no doubt been drawing closer since 2001 after lifting of Japan's post-nuclear test sanctions on India. Frequent prime ministerial exchanges have generated many agreements, joint declarations, and action plans regarding security and defense cooperation. In 2014, India and Japan upgraded their relationship to a special strategic and global partnership. In 2016, we signed a landmark civil nuclear agreement. 2020 saw India and Japan sign an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement that would allow the militaries of the two countries to exchange supplies and services on a reciprocal basis. All sounds very good. But notwithstanding all this, there has remained a feeling amongst observers that the bilateral relationship could have delivered much more and at a faster pace than it has. This was attributed by some to differing perceptions about the nature, the urgency, and the magnitude of the threat posed by China. Others saw it as Japan's exclusive focus on its security alliance with the USA, which could hinder closer cooperation. So let's take a look from seawards. That's where I come from. Japan, as a resource-deficient island state and a major economy, is totally dependent on sea lanes for its energy imports as well as commerce and industry. Given this crucial dependency, Japan faces serious capacity limitations in its ability to protect its seaborne trade and energy traffic. An oil tanker or a container ship would take between 25 to 30 days from the Persian Gulf to Japan, crossing 12,000 miles of ocean space. During this lengthy ocean transit, Japan's shipping would be vulnerable to traditional and non-traditional maritime threats. India, on the other hand, is a significant naval power with a dominant peninsular location, astride shipping lanes, and it plays a major role in ensuring maritime security in the Indian Ocean. So, close cooperation with a democratic India located midway along trade routes which connect East Asia with the Middle East and Africa would be advantageous to Japan. There has been collaboration between our navies and coast guards in recent times, but joint exercises and ship visits are useful only up to a point, and we need to look for other fertile grounds for cooperation. A technologically deficient India has much to gain from a relationship with an economic and industrial power such as Japan. In the military-industrial field, there is a range of equipment that has relevance to the Indian environment, but India's expectations of capability enhancement have remained unfulfilled, and I think it may be due to a communication gap. And I'll give you one example. For many years, Japan tried unsuccessfully to persuade India to acquire the Shin Maeba U-2 amphibious aircraft. At that point of time, the Indian Navy was probably more interested in another aircraft called the Kawasaki P-1 anti-submarine aircraft, which was more relevant to our needs. Again, Japanese professional expertise in areas like anti-submarine warfare, mine countermeasures would also be of immense value to us, but it has not been offered. But far more important than hardware is India's need for expertise in design and manufacture of advanced military equipment, because this would liberate India from import dependence and empower it as a regional security provider. A good example here would be Japan's latest Soryu-class submarine, which is powered by lithium-ion batteries. This is a radical step they've taken, which would be of immense interest to India. So the availability of advanced military technology could play an important role in the future course of India-Japan relations. But here we must acknowledge the challenge to security collaboration that arises from the constraints of Japan's post-war constitution. Its provisions deny not just the right of belligerency to the Japanese state, but also enforce restrictions on the transfer of arms and technology to other relations. And equally significant are the conditions imposed on Japan by the US-Japan Security Treaty. So these are all issues which are internal to Japan, and if things are to progress further, obviously Prime Minister Kishida and the Liberal Democratic Party will need to find a modus vivendi to ensure that defense cooperation progresses. So I'll conclude on a positive note with the reminder that Indo-Japanese relations are amongst the very few in Asia that carry no historical baggage of the past. Strong India-Japan security cooperation could be crucial in warding off hegemony and in creating a stable and peaceful order in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Admiral Prakash, for that brilliant opening address. I'd now like to invite Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary of India, to deliver his opening address.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Some of the things that I wanted to say have already been said by the Admiral, so I will not repeat anything in detail. The point I'd like to make, given the topic that we are discussing, the new great game and how India and Japan can collaborate to deal effectively with the new great game in Asia, the Indo-Pacific thrust and the emerging world order. Now, the new great game in Asia is certainly very different from the earlier one, as Admiral Prakash has pointed out, that pitted the British Empire against the Russian Empire centered around Afghanistan, Iran, East Turkestan, etc. But the point to remember is that India was colonized at that time, and so were large parts of Southeast Asia. Japan was a rising Asian power with militaristic ambitions and expansionist in its strategy. It had occupied parts of China. It had Taiwan under its governance, and as was pointed out, inflicted a military defeat on Russia. Now the US has replaced the British Empire. It has allies and bases in Asia, but then Southeast Asia is independent. India is a rising power. Japan's defense capabilities and the role it can play in this domain are constitutionally limited. It is dependent on the US for its defense. China has risen and threatens the security interests and the sovereignty of its neighbors. So this new great game, the phraseology to my mind is unfortunate, is to contain the China threat to the extent that it is possible. Now, unlike in the past, where certainly the British Empire did not build up the Tsarist Empire, China has been built up by the very countries which now feel threatened by its rise. In fact, the assumptions on which China was critically assisted in becoming the global power it has become today have been belied. China is now competing for global power, seeking to equal, if not surpass, the United States. When we talk of the great game, we have to take into account that China is today the biggest trade partner of those very countries who feel challenged by it, whether it's the US or Japan. And even in the case of India, China is our second biggest trade partner. It's the biggest trade partner of Southeast Asia, including countries which have had a hostile relationship within the past, like Vietnam, as well as Australia. More than that, if you're thinking of the great game, China is the biggest trade partner of countries in Central Asia, in large parts of Africa, as well as in Latin America. China is in fact tying up countries to its economy, gain control over critical materials in Africa and Latin America, control critical supply chains and technologies, and is seeking to close the technology gap with the United States and the West in general. Now, as was pointed out, its Navy is expanding at a pace unparalleled in history. Its naval fleet today is larger in number than that of the United States, though not in terms of tonnage. It is now expanding its nuclear capacity, as we know, at a pace not seen earlier, as well as missile capabilities to push the US Navy away from its coastline as much as possible and its near periphery. As we know, China has reclaimed militarized islands in the South China Sea in violation of UNCLOS and makes sovereignty claims which have no basis in international law. It is making territorial claims on India, even on a small country like Bhutan, and is repeatedly creating border incidents with us in violation of our established border agreements. It is also seeking to destabilize India's ties with its immediate neighbors. Its maritime strategy, the so-called Maritime Silk Road, is structured around establishment of ports and pursuing colonial practices like the 99-year lease it has got on Hambantota, potential naval bases, and from India's point of view, corridors through Myanmar to the Bay of Bengal and through Pakistan to the Arabian Sea, which in the years ahead is going to pose serious challenges to us. At the Pacific end, China is claiming the Senkaku Islands, other than the disputes it has with Southeast Asian countries over the Paracels and the Spratlys. Now China is claiming sovereignty over Taiwan, which it has not governed since the island was ceded to Japan by China in 1895. It is threatening use of force to take over Taiwan, and as we know, has made major military maneuvers after Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island. In the context of the emerging New World Order, China is projecting its development model as most suited to developing countries. The US is projecting the emerging conflict as between democracy and autocracies, but at a time when the Western democracies themselves are facing a crisis within. The China-Russia axis has got strengthened as a result of the West challenging Russia's vital security concerns, imposing sanctions, which they did even before the conflict in Ukraine erupted, and now are virtually breaking all links with Russia. On the other hand, we must also note that the US and the West in general are now practically ousted from the Eurasian mainland, especially after the exit of the United States from Afghanistan. So the emerging New World Order is likely to be built around some sort of a Russia-China axis in which Iran could join. West Asia is steadily moving out of the US orbit. Africa and Latin America are also developing a degree of independence in pursuing their foreign policies and have more linkages with China and Russia at the past. And especially in the case of Africa, it is at the cost of Europe as well as the United States. Europe itself has got weakened. India is playing a very difficult but so far effective balancing game. It is increasing its relations with the West especially the United States, but preserving its ties with Russia and hedging against China. So the new emerging world order seems to be some kind of a polycentric world or a multipolar world, if you like. Now, in this broader context, we see the emergence of the Indo-Pacific concept and the Quad. The Indo-Pacific concept has roots in former Prime Minister Abe's concept of the confluence of the two seas and the diamond of democracies, that is US, Japan, Australia, and India. And in his view and statements was openly directed at China. The Indo-Pacific concept is a new one because it links the security of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which has never been the case in the past. India has adopted this concept more and more, and now, in fact, is describing the Quad as a public good. And with China's expanding naval power, its potential entry into the Indian Ocean in a big way, for which it is already laying the groundwork, as I have mentioned earlier. The ASEAN countries are, of course, concerned about the Indo-Pacific concept and the Quad. To allay their concerns, the Indo-Pacific concept is being projected as one based on international law, freedom of navigation and overflight, respect for a rules-based order, adherence to UNCLOS, respect for the sovereignty of states, and is projected as open and inclusive in nature, which means that any country which subscribes to these principles can join this concept. Japan is terming this now as a free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan is recognizing the shift in global power to the east and accepts that this area can and will be the engine for economic growth for the world, and does not see the Indo-Pacific and Indo-Pacific concept as being in competition with existing institutions. Now, Quad is a product of the Indo-Pacific concept, but it has an agenda that covers beyond maritime security issues like quality infrastructure, maritime security, of course, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, education, human resource development, etc. As you know, in the meetings, the summit level of the Quad, an agenda has been worked out and working groups have been formed, and these cover the areas of vaccines, critical and emerging technologies, climate change, infrastructure, space, cybersecurity, etc. Now, if you really look at these areas, you'll find that most of them are connected directly or indirectly with the kind of challenge that China is posing and the need to develop alternatives to overdependence on China. Japan is now a permanent participant in the Malabar exercises, which I see as the sword arm of the Quad, though of course notionally the two are not linked. There have been exercises in the Indian Ocean and lately and recently in the Sea of Japan. India, in addition to the free and Indo-Pacific concept or the Indo-Pacific concept, is trying to increase its role and presence in the Indian Ocean, both conceptually and physically. So we have launched the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which is an open, non-treaty-based initiative for working together for cooperative solutions to common challenges in the region. It has 7 pillars, which is maritime security, maritime ecology, maritime resources, capacity building, disaster risk reduction, science and technology, and academic cooperation, trade connectivity, and maritime transport. Here again, the idea is to seek to counter the advantages that China has gained in many of these areas through its BRI project and generally through its economic rise. Now, some realities need to be noted, which is that India has vast responsibilities in the Indian Ocean itself. It is the biggest regional navy, which needs expansion. It has the Arabian Sea bordering it on the Gulf side and the east coast of Africa. And on the eastern side, we have responsibilities in the Bay of Bengal. It has, in addition to contend with the 2 Chinese corridors, which I mentioned earlier, and port establishment in key Indian Ocean countries. Now, it has limited capacity to mark its presence in the Western Pacific, though it does do maritime exercises in that area with Japan, of course, but with Vietnam, with some Asian countries, and even with Russia. So the answer is in burden sharing. Prime Minister Modi has said for the first time when he chaired the meeting of the UN Security Council under our presidency that India is a net security provider in the Indian Ocean, a kind of language which India has not used before. We have signed, as was pointed out, logistics agreements with the United States, Japan, and Australia. So India will cooperate within the Indo-Pacific concept and Quad, not as an ally, but as a partner. Now, many are critical that the Quad is having a large non-security agenda. I think this criticism is misplaced. In fact, this agenda, if it is progressed realistically, can give Quad great depth, and besides making it acceptable to the Indian public opinion, because we are a democracy and the public opinion has to be taken into account, and we know that there are great reservations about India joining any military alliance. So in this respect, Quad has gained a great deal of political acceptability because of the approach that we've had, and we should therefore make sure that the concept doesn't become controversial within India. As was pointed out, Japan's constitution still greatly restricts its defense role. The latest decisions announced by Prime Minister Kishida suggest that Japan is willing to take on more such responsibilities. It has unveiled a $320 billion military build-up plan with defense spending that will reach 2% of GDP by 2027. It is buying 500 Tomahawk missiles from the United States, spending $37 billion on missile upgrades, deploying more than 1,000 cruise missiles, and will develop its own missile capability, etc., etc. There is a great concern that China may at some stage attack Taiwan. It just so happens that in the Indo-Pacific concept or the Quad, Taiwan doesn't figure. Because the defense of Taiwan and the issue of Taiwan is left to the United States to deal with. Now, in terms of our defense cooperation with Japan, I will not go over the ground that has already been mentioned, so I'll skip that. And we've had many of these agreements, including sharing of classified information with regard to advanced technologies, etc., etc. There's also talk about Quad Plus, because if we want to build up a structure in Asia, which includes in it countries which are also part of Southeast Asia, that will be a big win, because there's a lot of concern in Southeast Asia about the Indo-Pacific concept and Quad, because they feel that their centrality to developing a regional security architecture would get diluted. Now, all the countries that are part of the Quad or are promoting the Indo-Pacific concept are not Southeast Asian countries. So if we can bring somehow Indonesia into these structures, that will be a major gain, without, of course, disturbing ASEAN unity. IPEF was mentioned. which is based on supply chain resilience, digital trade, clean energy, etc., etc. I'll conclude by saying that US is extremely critical to Japan for its security, which makes Japan, in a sense, hostage to US-China competition. Japan's own capacity in the Indian Ocean area is very limited. In fact, it has still a mindset that its critical strategic interests somehow stop at the Malacca Straits and don't extend into the Indian Ocean. That attitude is changing, but nevertheless, a lot of work has to be done in this regard. We have another problem, which is that Russia, with which we have very close ties, is opposed both to Quad and to the Indo-Pacific concept, despite our efforts to persuade Russia to have a more open-minded view of Quad and the Indo-Pacific concept, given that it itself is a Pacific country. And we have now agreements with them, the Vladivostok-Chennai corridor, which actually is axed on connectivity through the Indo-Pacific. But for the time being, they are not buying our arguments. The final point is that we don't need to institutionalize Quad, because there has been a view that it might be better to do so. We find that neither the G20 nor BRICS are institutionalized, and yet they are functioning quite well. We must, as I mentioned, strengthen Quad, give it more underpinning, economic underpinnings. Do not look upon Quad as some kind of a version of NATO. In fact, India's Quad membership in that respect gives a lot of confidence to ASEAN that India will not allow it to become a kind of a military alliance which poses big problems to ASEAN, because they don't want to choose. They want to have trade with China, but they want to have security from the United States. And finally, I don't think the Ukraine conflict should at all be linked to the Indo-Pacific issues. There are some statements that have come from the UK and elsewhere, even the EU, of extending NATO's remit to the Indo-Pacific. I think that will be a grave mistake and will, in fact, disturb the kind of partnerships that we are effectively developing in dealing with China. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sibal. We'll touch upon most of the topics you mentioned, but before that, I'd like to invite Vijay Chauthaiwale, who is in charge of the Department of Foreign Affairs with the Bharatiya Janata Party. A round of applause, please.
Thank you, Raj, for inviting me here. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here and talk on this very important subject of in our mind. Of course, no discussion on India and Japan relationship can start without remembering the ex-Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Shinzo Abe, who has famously said that it is we stand for the freedom, democracy, and rule of law, and also confluence of sea, which he has mentioned in his talk in Indian Parliament in 2007. Later, India's Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi in June 18, speaking in the Shangri-La Dialogue, he has defined Indo-Pacific region as stretching from the shores of Africa to the Americas. Japan is the major leader in modernization of Asia. The first generation Indians have seen how Maruti has revolutionized India's automotive sector. Then the next example is, of course, a Delhi Metro. Third example I can quote is about Delhi-Mumbai corridor, which has revolutionized the transportation of goods. And the ongoing project of Mumbai-Ahmedabad bullet train also is one of the major steps in revolutionizing the transport the way we think about. We also have technical intern training program. Under these initiatives, Japan accepts overseas Indians to get job training in India and Japan has also signed the MOU for promoting international cooperation through the transfer of skills, techniques, and knowledge. Since March 2022, in last few months alone, more than 100 students have joined this program, of which 40% are women. Technology transfer is also another important aspect. Within the Indo-Pacific framework, India and Japan are collaborating in defense technology and other critical technologies. Increased cooperation between Indian Navy, as mentioned by my previous speaker, also is evidence of the same. Another aspect I would like to touch is the soft power. There is increased interest in India about learning Japanese language. I myself have seen an experience where an institute run by my friend in Pune annually teaches at various levels more than 200 students in Japanese, and each one of them is immediately absorbed in one industry or other. It is just the tip of the iceberg, and the opportunities are much far than what is done today. Another aspect is, of course, a very subtle, is of Dharma-Dhamma convergence that has been talked about at the intellectual academic level, but it also shows the civilizational link between two countries. With 24th century, the Indo-Pacific region has gained utmost priority for different stakeholders, given the geopolitical and geoeconomic importance in the region. In the Indo-Pacific region, the partnership of Japan is unique and historical. The rise of China, which is mentioned here by my previous speakers, has challenged the existing world order. And in that context also, better ties between India and Japan in the framework of Quad becomes utmost important, even though it is not been talked very explicitly by the Quad countries. India and Japan are having a lot of similarities, the most important being that both are democratic countries and both are having ancient civilization. Both India and Japan can use their civilizational connect to nurture plurality as well as diversity in Asia. A lot of things have been talked about the supply chain disruptions, and especially after the COVID, everyone is now thinking about alternate supply chain routes, and many of them involve China plus one strategy, which involves the diversification of supplies of both raw material as well as the finished products. With trade tensions between between US and China, this China plus one strategy has gained new importance. The current war between Russia and Ukraine has also added to this new dimension. Therefore, India's quest to have a manufacturing hub and make in India can play a very important role on the countries like Japan, which are heavily dependent for the various supplies from China. As far as major areas of cooperations are concerned, the rule of international law, which has been again talked by my previous speakers, both countries, India and Japan, stand for values such as freedom, democracy, and rule of law. On the South China Sea issue, both countries believe that it is essential to settle the dispute according to international laws, and India and Japan oppose the claims of the territory in the disputed South China Seas. Maritime security, both countries have considered the security of sea lanes of communication as crucial stability of the region. China's ambition to become blue water navy has raised concern. The safety of merchant ships through the Gulf of Aden is one of the critical areas. And because almost 85% of the crude oil and 25% of LNG imported by Japan is transported using the sea lines communications through the Strait of Hormuz. India's 70% energy import also comes through the Indian Ocean. In addition to this security concern, there are several development agenda which both the countries can do it within India as well as in the developing countries. For example, India and Japan place a strong emphasis in connectivity in South Asia. Infrastructure is being developed in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar by Japan and India. Bangladesh is located at the intersection between India and ASEAN, and therefore this connectivity is of vital importance for both the countries. Japan is the only country that has allowed by India to invest in strategically sensitive regions like India's northeast region and also Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Another cooperation dimension is also development of South, which especially in Africa. Africa is also important for both the countries, and both the countries want to develop infrastructure and capabilities on the western rim of Indo-Pacific. In this regard, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, AAGC, vision document has released in May 2017 is very important, which envisage the objectives of improving economic connectivity between Asia and Africa through industrial networks. It is perceived as an attempt to counter China's RBI. Another common area of interest will be a cooperation against piracy and terrorism. India-Japan cooperation is important to contain piracy and terrorism in Indo-Pacific region. Terrorism launched from the western Indo-Pacific and targeted Mumbai in November 2008. Similarly, pirates in the Gulf of Aden, targeting the sea lanes of communication, it is a major threat to the security of western side. India has deployed its naval ships across the sea lanes as described by Admiral Arun Prakash, and Japan's cooperation will be seen in a major way to do this. In short, I would like to emphasize that India-Japan partnership, as described by many others in today's seminar, has a tremendous potential, and there is a lot more to do to overcome the hesitations from each other and come out with a new partnership that has no baggage of history, and at the same time there are enormous potential not only in terms of bilateral relations but also in the developing the other countries of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijay, and let's give him a very warm round of applause for that. And we just come to the Q&A session. I'll begin by asking Admiral Prakash that if you looked at the Quad arrangement, the security aspects seem to have been dominated now by the AUKUS, the formation of Australia, UK and USA, and the fact that USA is willing to sell or at least lease nuclear submarines. We don't know the exact details. Do you think it's time now for India? And there was a proposal by one of the American researchers, Ashley Tellis, you might know of him, talked about in his recent book that since relations with Russia might get impaired because of the Ukraine war, should we be getting into an arrangement with France, and France should enable us and cooperate in building nuclear submarines for us? What is your view on that in terms of strategy?
Yeah, I think that makes sense because Russia has been our main source of military hardware for the last 60, 70 years, almost. Even till today, 75 or 80% of our military hardware comes from Russia and from Ukraine. Now, both these countries are in they're engaged with each other. Their military industries are in deep trouble. So, as far as sourcing of military hardware is concerned, I think we can forget about Russia and Ukraine. Our own industry will take some time, even in spite of Atmanirbhar campaign and so on. It will take a few years, maybe a decade or two. So, in the interim, what should we do? So, that suggestion makes sense that we need to look elsewhere. There are many other sources of hardware, France, Israel, South Africa, etc. But more than hardware, we should be looking at capability, technology, so that the faster we become self-reliant, the better it will be for us. So, Sourcing of hardware is not really a problem. The problem will be to break away from the Russian legacy. You know, it's not easy if your armed forces have been operating with it for so many years. So breaking away there. The other issue is that we are continuously shying away from terming Quad as a security arrangement. I mean, we go out of our way to say, no, it is not an alliance, not a partnership. Well, two of the world's largest armies have been in a face-off for the last 30 months. Nothing seems to be moving, nothing seems to be changing. Therefore, something different needs to be done. And I think by seeking alliances, partnerships, and giving Quad a security connotation might send the right message to China. But by deliberately shying away from it, trade hasn't worked, trade is increasing, deficit is increasing, diplomacy hasn't started, military face-off is not working, so we got to look somewhere else. And I think the maritime domain is the right place. And perhaps don't make it a NATO, but give it a hint of security connotation. That
Ambassador Sibal, would you agree? A bit of a security aspect or teeth to Quad is what is required to contain China?
And can I just add one more thought to what Geeta had said? Do you think there'll be a war in Taiwan? Do you think China will invade Taiwan soon enough? And therefore all these things. So, I mean, Japan is directly interested in that question as well.
Well, insofar as Quad is concerned, I think everybody understands what the origin of this is and what it is intended for. Now, diplomacy requires that we don't unnecessarily project it as a security arrangement. Because, in fact, in more ways than one, it is precisely that. And it is intended to neutralize, to the extent possible, all the advantages in various domains that China has managed to acquire as a result of its rise. Now, we all know, I think we accept today, that war is not what it used to be. It's not simply a physical contest. So advanced technology, cyber, the whole concept of hybrid warfare, information warfare, everything is involved. So I don't think we gain anything very much in focusing too much on the security aspect. But if you look at the list of issues on which the Quad is cooperating, which were agreed at the Quad summit, almost all of them are related to China, to the gains China has made and the grip it has acquired on critical raw materials and technologies and weaponizing overdependence. It is to break that. Even connectivity. The agenda of connectivity, which may on the face of it doesn't seem to have a security dimension, is actually to counter BRI. And BRI is a vehicle and a machine for China to gain much greater global influence. So if you're countering China across the board, then we have to establish an agenda of cooperation which is not simply focused on security. That is one. The other, much more important from my point of view, or equally important, is that are we very clear in our mind that when push comes to shove in Ladakh or in the East, the Americans will come running? They won't. And we've all accepted that at the end of the day, we will have to combat this ourselves. Now, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy, but we have shown our determination, and for the time being, we have been able to successfully stand off against the Chinese. The Chinese can't have any ambitions to militarily conquer India or large parts of territory. So what will they do? Gain a few kilometers in Ladakh or here and there, some advantageous peaks here and there, which is a setback definitely. But it is not going to result in the crumbling of India, and we can cope with that. Therefore, whatever we do in terms of our strategy should be commensurate with the real danger. And the real danger is China's global power, which means that we must act on a much wider framework with our partners. And that, well, Australia is not that way a very significant country, but United States and Japan are. And United States has has all the technologies we need, all the, especially the space and this and that. And Japan has tremendous technology. Some of it were mentioned just now by Admiral Prakash. Only if they will loosen up and their own constitution would allow them to actually increase their defense cooperation with us. And in all the other areas that we are discussing, US is absolutely critical. And it has not deterred us at all, the fact that we are not tom-tomming the security aspect of Quad to strengthen our defense ties with the United States. Look at all we've done, foundational agreements, $22 billion of military hardware we bought from the United States. And the exercises we did, we just did an exercise 100 kilometers from from the LAC. It's very clear what we are doing. Therefore, I would suggest let's be careful, let's be diplomatic, let what we are doing speak for itself rather than unnecessarily creating a controversy around it. And finally, if you allow me 1 minute, very, very important to keep Russia on our side. Not simply because 70–80% of our equipment comes from there, but for the structure of our balance policy, for the balance of our foreign policy, we must have good relations with Russia. And Russia today needs India much more than it needed in the past. They have to balance China with strong relationship with India. And that is also in their mind, which is why Putin is now, glorifying India and our Prime Minister and our future.
Okay, I'd like to take the conversation to Mr. Chauthaiwale. All through the day, we've been speaking about India-Japan opportunities and engagement, but there has been a lot of conversation, Raj, about how underwhelming the interest has been of Japan when it comes to India. Now, you have been working a lot into getting and engaging with Japan and the outreach, but do the soft power diplomacy that now has become a very important part of Government of India's toolkit, do they really translate into diplomatic deliverables?
If you ask me this question in a general term, yes, it has really worked in many contexts. And whenever Prime Minister goes abroad, it is visible, not only in terms of the yoga and wellness and our traditional way of medicine, but also India's diaspora has become a big asset for India. But that has not been significantly leveraged as far as India-Japan is concerned. That also is the fact. Japan has a very little Indian diaspora. Of course, one of the biggest connection is our civilizational connect, and many attempts are being made to revive that. I heard that there are now chartered flights coming from Japan to Bodh Gaya, specifically to visit Bodh Gaya and taking them back to Japan. So these are some, I would say that green shoots, but potential is enormous and we need to work much harder to strengthen it.
I think we have got time just for one more round of questions before you wind up. And maybe what you could do is leave us with one, big thing that you would think India and Japan should do. Starting with you, Admiral Prakash. If there's one big thing that you'd want India and Japan to do, what would that be?
The point you would raised about Russian hardware, and I think that should weigh heavily on our minds, those who are concerned with national security, that Russian and Ukrainian hardware is no longer an option for us. And secondly, the Prime Minister himself has been emphasizing this self-reliance business. So we need technology, we need military technology, and unless we become self-reliant in major weapon systems, all this talk about strategic autonomy, etc., is meaningless. So Japan is a friend, it's a technologically highly advanced country. We should persuade Japan, in spite of their they'll have to do something about the constitutional constraints. But despite that, we need to reach out to Japan and persuade them that they need to share for mutual benefit advanced military technology with us so that India becomes self-reliant and become a significant Indo-Pacific power. Because so far we can call ourselves regional power, net security provider, etc. But as long as our military industrial complex is not strong enough, all these claims will ring hollow. So the first step we need to do to make ourselves a credible power is to strengthen our military-industrial complex. And that's one place that Japan can help.
That's a good thought, Admiral.
Couple
Ambassador
of things. One is that Japan has a lot of work to do in order to strengthen its own defense capabilities. After all, well, China is our neighbor, but so is China their neighbor. And flashpoints are very much there, not only in South China Sea, Senkaku, but Taiwan and North Korea. So they haven't, at the moment, reached levels of self-defense capabilities that they need to build up. Are they in a position to broaden their larger defense effort to also strengthen defense ties with India in the areas that have been mentioned? Could happen, but it's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. Number two, I don't think Japan will be a step ahead of the United States in this regard. They're very closely aligned with the United States. If the United States wants to strengthen our capabilities and actually support our Atmanirbhar movement agenda, they can do so much more effectively than Japan. But Japan will be in lockstep with the United States. If the United States does more, Japan will do more. If the United States is hesitant, Japan will not want to do more than what the United States is politically willing to do. Therefore, we must be realistic. And the last thought is that just as they transformed our automobile industry, we've been saying, come, transform our electronics industry. If you look at facts and figures about our electronics exports, they probably will be larger than our oil exports in a short while. They have the capability of doing that. It has defense aspects to it too. And this is something they can do without their constitution prohibiting them from doing so.
Vijay?
I think in the post-Abe era, on one side, and also the current dynamics in the Indo-Pacific, both India and Japan needs to reassure themselves that we need to add new dimensions to our development agenda, as Ambassador Sibal has said. In addition to automobile and connectivity, there are many other sectors, and also assure the other smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific that both India and Japan are equally committed for the equitable partnership with those countries to reassure them to be a partner in their development.
On that note, it's time up for this session. Thank you so much for joining us over here. The big takeaway from the session is that there are a lot of opportunities between India and Japan. Quite a bit of them are being looked into, but there is more to be done. Thank you so much, Mr. Chauthaiwale, Ambassador Sibal, and Admiral Prakash. A big round of applause, please.